Friends, it is my hopes and expectation to relate to you the legacy of J. Frank Norris, of whom I was well acquainted. I know from different aspects the story of this man's life. I want to relate to you today events that I feel have not been fully covered and have been given proper recognition. And that is the spirit of a perennial revival that existed for over 40 years in the First Baptist Church of Fort Worth, Texas, of which J. Frank Norris was the esteemed pastor. And I was there for at least nearly 20 years of that period of time. Most people are familiar with the negative aspects with which J. Frank Norris has been labeled with. But very few have had the unique privilege of sitting under his ministry and observing those events which really characterize the true J. Frank Norris. You would have had to have been present to have a full appreciation of what took place Sunday after Sunday in that renowned place, hallowed ground, so to speak, of the First Baptist Church, of which J. Frank Norris labored for many years. I want to relate to you at this time a comparative note of significance. Everyone is familiar with the first church that was established in Jerusalem. Indeed, a most noteworthy event, which I have given that title to this video. And I want to compare, or at least try to, for your benefit, to compare what happened on the day of Pentecost in the establishment of that first church, characterized by noteworthy actions that truly identifies the workings of the first New Testament church, and try as best I can to illustrate the significance and comparison with the ministry of J. Frank Norris. It's not that I would hope to equate his ministry to any extent with that of the first church, but be that as it may, there is some similarity. And after my presentation, if you fail to pick up on what the vast crowds that came to that church, what they saw week after week, Sunday after Sunday, then your perception is flawed because you don't have an appreciation of the full understanding. Let me just read as a background concerning the establishment of the first church in Jerusalem, found in the 2nd chapter of Acts, verse 26, and it reads as follows: "And they, continuing daily with one accord in the temple, and breaking bread from house to house." I want to underscore that phrase, house to house, because that characterizes the number one ingredient as the main activity in which a church should be engaged in. And that's precisely a unique characteristic of the First Baptist Church of Fort Worth, Texas. It was a phenomenal activity that has been talked about very, very little. And so, as we take note of the beginning of the New Testament church in Jerusalem, indeed, this is a story worth telling over and over again, because it should characterize the spirit of every New Testament church. But, regretfully, these things are passé, a thing of the past, resorting to methods, in most cases, that are unscriptural. And buried beneath all of the peripheral, sensational episodes of J. Frank Norris's ministry, and that's what the focus has been upon from the writers who have attempted to write a biographical sketch of the man, J. Frank Norris. But I say to you, humbly speaking, that the real story of this man, whose life was filled with both pathos and victory, has never adequately been told. It's a story that has never been told in detail, and that's because those who were present Sunday after Sunday have already passed off the scene. Sadly, not many records can be found. Thankfully, I'm one of the remaining few that remembers vividly much of what transpired during those glorious years. And so a glimpse of the early Jerusalem church gives us insight into what characterized the uniqueness of that church in Jerusalem, likewise characterized and made unique the First Baptist Church of Fort Worth, Texas. Now, while not attempting to equate the ministry of J. Frank Norris on the same level of the early church, you can be assured that Norris did indeed attempt, and to a great measure, he did pattern his ministry on the same principle, as did all of his associates after Norris had left the scene. You study the lives of those who were associated with J. Frank Norris, and you will see that at some point in their ministry they have exhibited the same philosophical attitude toward what it takes to build a real soul-winning church, thus creating a perennial revival. Now, to tell the story in as brief a recall as possible, the ministry of J. Frank Norris, as told by his close associates, was the phenomenon of a perennial revival atmosphere. Friends, let me underscore that phrase, a perennial revival atmosphere. It doesn't happen very often. Sad to say, it is not happening today. Most of the revivals that carried on today are that utilize gimmicks, and TV has not been really the proper motive by which the gospel should be perpetrated. It should come forth as a message flaming from the pulpits, patterned after the likeness of that New Testament Jerusalem church. So, in closing, when the rule which governs contextual contents runs its course, and this is a fact that I like to emphasize, much of what has been said about J. Frank Norris, much of it is taken out of context. But when the course has been run, and it may take 100 years or so, researchers will find that the vast parishioners, that is, the people who sat in those pews over a period of 40 years, were transfixed with what they witnessed Sunday after Sunday. And of all the sensational skirmishes in which Norris was involved, they were only a glitch in the mind of most people. Friends, I was there. And so those so-called sensational tactics, they were not discussed. They were not paramount in the estimation that most people had. They were transfixed by what they saw Sunday after Sunday. Most of them didn't even realize they were a part of an independent, fundamental Baptist Church. I knew these people, and so I knew what they were thinking. The controversies which surrounded their pastor were not even given a scintilla moment of thought. I speak from an eyewitness first-hand experience. But yet, 60 years after his death, the legacy of a gun-toting parson arouses more interest than, well, Gail, you messed me up.